Hello everyone. I guess you're watching over YouTube because no one's here on this Hangout. This tech talk is going to be about how I switched to Vim on my fourth attempt. This is going to be quite maybe personal story about my struggles with Vim in the past and how I finally made the switch 5 months ago. To give you a short introduction, previously I was using TextMate for a couple of years and then I switched to Sublime. I think these two editors were like fairly similar, maybe at least on the basic level of knowledge that I've had. Over the years I tried Vim several times. I also had a chance to pair program with a couple of heavy Vim users. I think it was a good experience, but it was not enough to convince me to switch and definitely not enough for me to become productive in Vim. And finally, about 5 months ago, I've made a decision to switch to Vim seriously, like to seriously try it. And turns out it's worked well. I invested some effort into that. So I was thinking there may be some other people like me who wanted to switch to Vim and maybe tried several times without success. So the purpose of this tech talk is to tell a few words how I used Vim, how I learned Vim, how I approached learning Vim. I'm also going to give you a bunch of tips for beginners. The tips are going to be somewhat random because they are based on my experience. But I hope at least some of these things that I will cover are things that affect everyone who's beginning with Vim. And a short disclaimer that this tech talk is not going to explain that Vim is the best editor out there, or I'm not going to argue that I'm more productive now than I was before. That's completely separate matter, and I will tell a few words about it in the summary at the end. But overall, I don't intend to convince you to switch to Vim completely. But if you wanted to try it, I wanted to give you some advice on how to start and how to spend maybe the first few weeks or maybe months. So how I start? Okay, maybe a few words about the basics. So I'm not going to explain the complete basics like basic HJKL navigation, like how to move the cursor around or how to how to enter the insert mode. These are the things that you'll probably find anywhere when you Google for any Vim tutorial or I don't know, Vim basics or something. And the thing that I've noticed is that it's definitely not enough to follow through these tutorials because they are just too basic and they only give you some initial advice, but that's not enough to become productive. Even if you spend a lot of time training what these tutorials tell you, you still need to learn much, much more to really be productive. At least that was my experience. Okay, so the first thing I did, and it's not an advertisement, I subscribed to some paid tutorials on Appcase, and I'm glad I did it, but I don't think it's necessary. So I won't repeat the advice there, at least not all of that, but I don't think you have to pay for it. I think paying for the paid tutorials helped me because, well, I invested not only time but also money, so I treated it more seriously. But like hundreds of people have learned Vim without using paid tutorials, so you don't have to. If you want to, I think it's a good choice. So the first thing that the tutorial advertised was following through Vim Tutor. And Vim Tutor is a built-in tutorial that I think you can enter with. Tutor, I think, yeah. Looks like that. And it teaches you the basics that I mentioned before. It's not very long, and it's definitely worth doing. Even if you had some experience with Vim in the past, for instance, as I did, as I mentioned, I've had a couple of pair programming sessions with Vim users. Even after all of that, and even knowing some basics, at least I thought, it's definitely worth going through this tutorial because it just goes very comprehensively through things that you really should know if you want to use Vim. And besides that, you should not only read it, you should really complete all the exercises, because as the tutorial explains, the Vim is all about the muscle memory and learning how, like, learning as in making the connections between your brain and your hands so that things really go automatically and quickly. So you should definitely do the tutorial if you want to, and not only read it. Besides, overall, I think it's a good piece of advice when learning Vim to always not only to always just try to repeat things. For instance, like whenever I made a mistake trying to enter some complex command, I would usually start over and try to do it again, this time properly. Again, the purpose is just to train your muscle memory. Okay, the second piece of advice from the tutorial, which I think was also really good, was to prepare post-it notes with keys to learn. Like, I think that in order to master Vim, you will need to memorize at least 20, maybe 30, maybe more keyboard shortcuts. And there is no way you learn it in an instant, so it will take time, and you will probably need to do it step by step. So what I did was I stick the post-it note to my laptop, and I wrote down a few shortcuts that I wanted to learn. Once I knew them, I would cross them out or maybe erase them, whatever, and write down some new ones. After a few days or weeks, I ended transitioning this to Apple Notes because I needed to share between two laptops. And by the way, I think it's a good advice if you are okay with having notes online and not on paper. It's a good advice because now I have a pretty long list of things that I still need to learn. If it was a post-it note, I would have lost it a long time ago. And another thing that I did when I transitioned to Apple Notes was I started not removing things that I learned, but moving it to another note. So thanks to that, it was easier for me to prepare this talk because I knew what were my steps when learning. So these were my first steps. And a few tips about learning, and at least what I did was I really spent a lot of time researching, Googling for good articles, looking for video tutorials, and so on and so on. So I feel like I invested quite a lot of time. But a really good thing that was not obvious for me was to go through these resources again and again. So let's say I found a really good article explaining some Vim concepts or just giving some advice. I would usually read it, write down a few tips or like keyboard shortcuts or commands or whatever that I felt I needed to learn. But also I would save the link to this article. And after a few weeks, it's almost always a good idea to go back because you will find things that you didn't notice before or things you didn't realize were important or useful. So I did a lot of that, like rereading resources, and I think it really helps. Another thing that helps with Vim is mnemonics. So because in Vim, as I said, you need to learn like 20 or 30 shortcuts. Most of the time, they really make sense. Not always, but most of the time. So it's really important, at least it was really important for me, to learn some mnemonics, some ways to memorize these shortcuts. I can give you an example. So there is a plugin that is called Vim Surround that I use. It's pretty useful, and it allows you to, among many things, it allows you to surround a word with parentheses. Whoops. Like that, for instance. So the shortcut to do it is pretty complex because something like that. So initially, it was really hard for me to memorize that. Especially, I had no way of remembering this YS. What does it stand for? But at some point I found that it means yes, surround in Word with parentheses. And suddenly it makes sense. And now, maybe not now, but for a long time, every time I needed to type it, I would just memorize, I would just recall this mnemonic, yes, surround in Word, and it worked. So I think it's a really good idea to focus on mnemonics, and if you can't find a mnemonic for something, it's gonna be hard to learn. Okay, the next thing I did was resisting the urge to customize. So I started with a very small Vim config file. There is a lot of advice to start with a small config file and develop it over time, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, you should probably understand what you put in your config file and not blindly copy stuff from elsewhere. And this also means that I resisted the urge to install a dozen of plugins. Even though I ended up installing plenty of plugins pretty quickly, I still tried not to go too far with that. And last but not least, I think a very important piece of advice that I found somewhere was to find some sort of killer features in Vim. So the things that will make you keep coming back. Yeah, we'll go into details with that. So speaking of customization, so I said it's a good idea to start with small number of customizations, but I think you will still need to customize a little bit. In my case, I started with NeoVim. I don't really have a good explanation why. I mean, NeoVim was just out there, and I thought, like, why not? And turns out it has sensible defaults out of the box. If you don't start with NeoVim and you use plain Vim, you will probably need to copy a few lines of configuration, like removing compatibility with some ancient Vim versions and stuff like that. But overall, NeoVim is like, if you start with empty config file, it's usable. Another thing I did in the beginning was configuring the editor config. Editor config is a special file format. It's not Vim specific. That allows you to configure things like indentation, whether it's tab or spaces, and so on. I did it before. I didn't want to learn Vim commands for that, and I still don't know these Vim commands, but it's working pretty well. I can actually show you the editor config file looks like that. So it's pretty simple. And the next thing I mentioned that I didn't want to start with too many plugins, but you will need some plugins. And there are a few plugin managers. And I remember in my previous attempts with Vim, I was quite confused and I didn't know which one to use. So this time I just used Plug, and Plug is an excellent choice. It's easy to use, it works, and I don't remember having any single problem with that. I'm not going to say it's the best one because I don't really know much about the others, but if you're just starting and if you need to make a choice, I highly recommend just use Plug, which is a good plugin manager for Vim. And a few other things so that I put initially in my VimRC are some improvements to searching, because if I remember correctly, searching is not case insensitive by default. So it's a good idea to make it so. Another thing that I've noticed was relative line numbers. I can try toggling it off. So the default is that you will see just line numbers, which is kind of useful, but at some point you will learn that you can jump to any line with a simple command. So like most of the time I don't use these line numbers, and one of the pieces of advice I found was to enable relative numbers. The idea was that I could easily, for instance, like go 3 lines above or 4 lines below or whatever. I don't use it as much, but I think it's looking kind of nice. So yeah, whatever. Let's move on. One of the best pieces of advice that I found was to configure leader key. So what is leader key? So the explanation that I've read is that in Vim, lots of keys are bound by default to some commands or shortcuts or whatever. And because of that, the recommended way for users to set up their key bindings is through a leader key. So a leader key is a special key that precedes any, not any, but like it's usually used to precede the custom key bindings for the user. And by default, I think it's set to / or something like that. I don't even remember that, because one of the first thing I did was set it to spacebar. And this is really, really good advice, because spacebar is really easy to hit. And when you do that, it's really easy to start adding new leader key bindings, because it's just easy. So to give you an example, what I did was, so one of the Vim's feature is searching, and searching by default will highlight all the results. Even after you don't need these search results anymore, they still keep being highlighted. So there is a command that hides it, and it's called, I think, no-h. But I wouldn't want to type no-h anytime I was done with searching. So I've made a key binding that is space h that just calls it and hides the highlight. So that's one of the examples of how you can use the leader key. There are many, many more that I use every day. And the purpose is just that you should figure out what things are you doing often and what things can be automated like that. Another one that I commonly use is one for ordering. So I just made leader O that sorts lines alphabetically. This is pretty useful. Well, it depends on your needs, but it's pretty useful for me. Yeah, okay, so that was leader mappings. The next thing that I wanted to cover is having things that will make you keep coming back. Again, that's a piece of advice that I read somewhere. And I think it's really important, because initially when you start learning Vim, you will feel that you're super, super slow, you're making tons of mistakes, and you will very quickly start to question, what's the purpose to do all of that when I'm so slow and I would have done all of that 20 times more in any other editor. And it's probably true that you would do most of the things faster in other editor when you're beginning, but I was able to notice a few things that I could do in Vim initially, like when I started, that made me feel like I'm efficient. Even if it's just a simple command, I felt efficient. And one of the first things that I learned was change command. It's a command that allows you to change, for instance, the rest of the line, or change to the end of the word, or change the whole line. So this is a pretty simple command, but instantly I felt like, okay, so if I wanted to change since the cursor to the end of the line in, let's say, Sublime, I would need to hit, I think, Shift, Command, right arrow, and then start typing. So having just capital C do that was a nice improvement. Text objects. This is another thing that is fairly easy to learn, and this is really making you more productive. So the idea of text object is that in Vim, there are ways to run a command on a larger piece of text. So there are, of course, ways to run a command on a single line, for instance, but or multiple lines, but there are smarter ways to do that. And an example of a text object is a word. So let's say I wanted to change this word. So there is a command C for change, and we can make the command operate on a text object for a particular word. So if I type CIW, I'm changing this word. Alternatively, I can change a sentence. like that. This is text object for sentences. It's working really, really well for programming because there are all kinds of programming text objects. So for instance, let's say we have parentheses here. There is a text object that represents what's inside of the parents. So we can easily select that, or we can easily change what's in the parents, or we can easily change what's outside of parents, like that. So these things are pretty easy to learn, and they can instantly make you more productive, and you can start feeling, okay, that's something I would not do as quickly in another editor. Another thing I discovered pretty early was J for joining lines. I guess I discovered it accidentally by hitting capital J accidentally. It's a pretty nice feature because you can hit J and join multiple lines of text. Again, it's not super complicated thing, but it probably would take a few more keystrokes in some other editor. Another one, it's JQ. It's used for wrapping blocks of text. So for instance, like that, it will make the text wrap at 80 characters, I think. You can, of course, configure that. Again, that's something that you can probably do in other editors, but I was always too lazy to learn how to do it in Sublime or TextMate. If there was a way to do it, probably there was. In Vim, I somehow learned it because I had this mindset of learning useful things. So yeah, so that was another one. Another one are quick fix windows. I can show you an example. So let's say I'm grabbing for something. I can make the results of grep appear in a window, and I can easily jump between results. So I won't go into details what are the exact key bindings. You can find it, but it's a pretty neat feature, and like probably you can do it in some other editor. I think it's in Vim it's working fairly well. Another killer feature that I found was like making me feel very efficient was the surround plugin that I mentioned before. So let's say I have some code or some words in parentheses, and I need to change them to braces or to square brackets or to square brackets with spaces. There are lots of ways to do it. There are lots of things you can do with Vim Surround very quickly. So I think it's a nice plugin. And besides, it kind of follows the Vim philosophy, so it operates on text objects, and I don't know, like when I added it, I just felt it's a nice thing, although it took me some time to learn it. Another thing that I learned fairly quickly, there is a plugin called Vim Unimpaired. It has a lot of bindings. One of my favorite ones is for adding white space before or after something. I don't know why, but I just keep adding white space all the time. So I just felt like I can do it more easily than I would do it in some other editor. Yeah, okay. Still, even after we find some things that work well for us and that we enjoy doing in Vim, there is a large number of things that are super, super annoying. And in my case, these things were really slowing me down. So I would like to go through the list of a few things that were really slowing me down, and how in most cases I was able to figure something out. Hopefully for someone else learning Vim, this will be useful, because chances are you are struggling with the same things. So the first thing, and I think this is one of the most slowing down problems when learning Vim, is navigation between open files. So if you are coming from other editors, you are probably used to have tabs. In Vim, you can also have tabs that look like that. But very early, I learned that tabs are not really a recommended feature for navigating between open files. And I guess the reason for that is that key binding for cycling through tabs is like GT or G capital T to go the opposite way. I was thinking like this is going to be super slow and like much worse than what I'm used to. So another way to have a few open files is to have splits that look like that. Splits are okay. I used to use them for some time, but again, with splits you can only open like maybe 2 or 3 files. Maybe you have a very large screen, you can fit in a few more, but it's not really a solution for navigating between any file in the project. So what I've learned that the Vim answer to that is to have multiple buffers, and buffers are like open files. So basically you just see only, like if you have only one window like I have right now, you only see like your one file that is open. This is one buffer, but I can open more files and just like not have them visible at the moment. So buffers are not really hard to use, but there is an option that makes them completely unusable, and this is the default. So the option is called set hidden. So this option, when it's not set, and by default I think it's not set, you cannot navigate between buffers without saving files. So this is super annoying because when you're in the middle of editing, you need to first save, and only then you can jump to another file, because otherwise Vim will warn you that you have unsaved changes. So with set hidden, you can just navigate between buffers. So how do you navigate between buffers? There is a Vim feature that is called wild menu. It's not bad. So we can use wild menu like that. So we type the command V, and we type an asterisk, and we hit tab, and now we can navigate between between the list of open buffers. So of course that's a lot of typing, but you can make a leader binding for that, and that's what I did for some time, and it's worked well. But after some time, I decided that I need fuzzy matching, and wild menu doesn't have fuzzy matching, so I switched to Ctrl P plugin. And with Ctrl P, there is a list that looks like that. And by fuzzy matching, I mean I can type something in the middle of the word and it will match. So again, I've mapped it to leader B, which kind of makes sense. That's the nice thing with leader bindings, that you choose the mnemonic. So so that's half of the story. There is another key binding that I think is super useful. I think the default is something like control something. Never mind. There is a key binding that I don't even remember that switches between current buffer and the previously open buffer. I've mapped it to leader, which means double space in my case. And when I hit space twice, instantly switch to the previously open buffer, and then I can go back. And I've noticed that most of the time it's enough for me to jump between two files. But when that's not enough, I use a feature of Ctrl P that is like most recently used files. So I just hit space M, and I have a list of recently open files, and that's usually enough. Yeah. So when I figured out these few things, I was like much faster than I was initially. So you can imagine that I was like super slow initially. Okay, the next thing is exploring directory structure. So it happened that I was switching Vim at the time when I was changing job, and when I changed job, I had to get familiar with a few new code bases, like maybe 3 or 4 new repositories initially, and I felt really lost, because I was used to, from Sublime and before that from TextMate, that you would always have the file navigator on the side that you could use to navigate between files and just get understanding what's the directory structure of a project and so on. So I felt completely lost. And there is a plugin for Vim that's called Nerdtree. A few tutorials I found recommended not to use it, and I chose to follow that advice. because I really wanted to learn the Vim way and not to transfer my habits from previous editors to Vim. So so I didn't install Nerd3, but really for a really long time I was completely lost and I didn't really know how to navigate files properly. I knew about the default in Vim that is called netrw. It's the built-in explorer. That's what you will see when you open Vim. So it looks like that. Allows you to navigate. It's become much more useful. I don't even remember how the default config of netrw looked like, but the problem is that the default was not a tree view, and I didn't realize for some time that netrw has a tree mode. So once you enable the tree mode, it's pretty normal way to explore files. I wouldn't say it's much different than what you know from Sublime or TextMate or Atom or whatever. It's also nice because you navigate it with keyboard, you can search and so on. So so it turns out this is solved problem in Vim, but you really need to tweak the configuration a little bit. My only issue, okay, I have a few issues with netrw. I think it's a little bit buggy. It might be a matter of some plugins that I installed, so it does not always work the way I want it. But like when it doesn't work, it's usually for something I could do in the terminal anyway. So usually I would use terminal for anything more advanced, but for general exploration, it's good enough, I think. Okay, so the next issue that I've had was that in Vim, as I guess you might already know, you have several modes, and there is the normal mode, and in normal mode you are not entering text. And when you want to enter text, you need to switch to the insert mode. There are a couple of ways to do it. I don't want to go into details, but most of the time you're not in insert mode, but you also spend plenty of time in insert mode, and you also need to exit the insert mode quite often. So the way to insert mode is to hit escape. And for me, it was like completely unreasonable. Why would I want to go to the corner of my keyboard to hit escape every time I needed to exit the insert mode? There is a historical reason for that. You may find some pictures of the original computer where Vim or VI actually was developed on, and escape was in a completely different place on the keyboard, so it completely made sense back then. It does not make sense on a modern keyboard. So the first thing that I learned I could do was to remap caps lock to escape. It's actually it's actually a built-in feature in macOS now. If you're not on a Mac, you can probably do it in some way on any other platform. That was a good thing, and it made me much more productive. However, after some time, I learned that a lot of people remap caps lock to control. So I did that, and I had no key to replace escape now because you have only one caps lock on a keyboard. So I was using caps lock as control, and it took me a while to find an alternative. So one thing is that you can actually hit control with left square bracket, and this is the same as escape. You can also hit control C, which is almost the same as escape. I don't know exactly what's the difference, but there is some subtle difference between that. But what I ended up doing is that I've added a mapping control S that saves the file and insert mode and exits the insert mode. And I use it all the time. And I think it's a good solution because I just keep saving my changes all the time. And yeah, it works. I think the perfect setup, and it was possible to do it on a Mac some time ago with Carabiner. There is a tool called Carabiner for remapping keyboard on Mac OS. So with Carabiner, you could make caps lock work both as control and escape. So the idea was that if you pressed it and kept pressing, it would behave as control. But if you pushed it and released, it would behave as escape. So at some point, the Caribbean released a new version for the new version of macOS, and it's not supported right now. Hopefully that changes at some point, but right now it might be not an option. So that was, again, like initially I was like really struggling with that. When I remapped my keyboard, I was much faster. Okay, the next thing is window navigation. So I mentioned this split windows. Oops. So when we have two split windows, the way to navigate between those is to use Ctrl W and one of the HJKL keys to navigate. So somehow I couldn't learn it. I mean, pressing Ctrl something and then something else was like below my abilities or things that I can do quickly. At some point, I learned that you can hit Ctrl W twice, and it cycles through the open windows, and most of the time it's good enough for me. So if you're like me and you're struggling with the most common combination, this is an alternative. Okay, so another thing that I struggled with was knowing in which mode I'm in. So actually, there is, I think it's a default. So when you are in insert mode, Vim will display insert at the bottom of the window, which is kind of helpful to know that you are in the insert mode. But most of the time, I won't look at the bottom of the window before I start typing. So quite often, I would start typing thinking that I'm in insert mode, and I would just do something really strange that I would have to undo, or yeah, so that's usually what happens to me. So actually, there is a really simple solution for that, is to have different cursors in insert mode and normal mode. So I have a block cursor in normal mode, but when I'm in insert mode, it's the thin cursor. And in NeoVim, it's just a matter of setting an environment variable. It should be possible to do in plain Vim. I know exactly how, but I'm sure it's possible. By the way, there is also a setting that shows the command as we are typing that. So for instance, let's say I wanted to change a word, so I start typing CAW, and we can see that the command appears here at the bottom. It's kind of nice, but honestly, I don't use it that often. Okay, so the next thing that was really driving me crazy was pasting from clipboard. So one thing is that Vim has registers, and well, like you need to read about registers. But basically, like when you copy text, it ends up in a register. You can choose which register you copy from, and so on and so on. But one thing that was driving me crazy was that when I was in insert mode and I was typing something, if I wanted to paste anything, I would need to quit the insert mode. Then I could paste it, and then I would need to come back to the insert mode. That was driving me crazy. So it turns out there are keyboard shortcuts that you can use in insert mode as well. And one of them is Ctrl-R. So what you can actually do is you can hit Ctrl-R when you are in insert mode, choose which register you are pasting from. In my case, it's 0, and it works. So it's a good thing to know that you can paste while in insert mode, and it's also a good thing to research a little bit about keyboard shortcuts in insert mode, so that you don't always need to quit insert mode for some very basic things. Another thing about pasting is that I've set up a leader mapping space R that shows me what's in my registers. This is pretty useful when you mess things up, or when you are learning about registers and you can't really memorize what goes where. Honestly, I still use it all the time, and I still feel like I'm not super productive with registers, but without leader R, I would be completely lost. Okay, the last thing that that's still a little bit bothering me, and I haven't really solved that yet, is multiple selections. So if you were using Sublime before, there is a really nifty feature in Sublime that's multiple selections. So with Command D, you can easily select multiple occurrences of the same text in your document and start typing and make edits in multiple places. So usually when I talk to Vim users about it, they tell me that, oh, you can use macros. And it's true, you can use macros. I think macros are not as fast as multiple selections, and they definitely require you to think more. That might be a matter of me still learning, because maybe when I become better with Vim, I won't have to think as much using macros. But for now, I'm still slower with macros. On the other hand, with macros, you can probably do some things that you would not be able to do with Command D. But honestly, like Sublime's Command D is pretty good. And I've seen there are some plugins for that in Vim. I haven't tried those yet because, as I said, I wanted to like kind of follow the Vim philosophy. Sorry, I lost. I was going to show how to use macros. So the way to use macros is that you hit Q and usually some letter. Usually I just hit QQ, and now we are recording. And anything we do is recorded, like basically all the keystrokes that we type are recorded. And this way we can record some complex command and repeat it. So we can do things like, like unquoting over multiple lines, or like basically any complex operation. So that's what I mean by saying that it gives you more power than multiple selections, but I still think it's slower. Okay, so these were like the things that I was struggling with the most when I started. We're close to wrapping up, so just a few things. It's worth reading same articles again, as I said before. With plugins, I highly recommend to choose those that follow the Vim philosophy. Basically, I assumed there is this guy, his name is Tim Pope, I think. So I just chose that, like any plugin that he's made, I feel comfortable installing. With other plugins, I may make more research. And another thing worth doing is stealing from other people's VMRCs. There is quite a lot of neat tips that you can find in other people's VMRCs. Yeah. Okay, so to sum things up, is it worth it to learn Vim? Well, I'm glad I did it, and even though I still can't say with 100%, being 100% sure that I'm more productive than I was, I'm not quite sure if I am, but it's definitely fun to learn something new, especially see how you can be so lost when you are used to a different editor, and when you switch to Vim, and see like over a couple of weeks and months, you can become quite productive. So I don't really consider switching back unless someone impresses me with their editor and show me how cool it is, maybe. And the other benefit that I have from learning Vim is that over the past years, I was quite lazy about increasing my skills with tools that I use every day. So I was quite lazy with using even Sublime, quite lazy with learning other tools, and quite lazy with customizing things. With Vim, you can't be lazy, because if you are lazy, you won't get past that threshold where you become productive. And because of that, I started to spend more time customizing things, and overall, I think it's a good thing that I became less lazy about it. And that's basically it. I wrote down a few links that I can paste on Slack after this talk. And yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed. And if you choose to learn Vim, if you haven't already, I hope it's going to be a great journey for you. If you have some tips for me, feel free to reach out to me on Slack and tell me what I'm doing wrong or what I could do better. Okay, so thank you and bye.